On a sweltering March morning, Chanawanga Mangi awoke to the sounds of Shakahola. The mangrove kingfisher chirped in the trees. The bristles of the shopkeeper's broom swept the fine red dust from her entryway. Children laughed as they made their way into their designated classrooms. The humid Kenyan air hung in his throat just as it did like most mornings, but today, something was off. He could not shake the uneasy feeling that sat on his chest and gnawed a hole in the back of his mind. This feeling of anxiety and unrest was due in part to the recent uptick in rumors that something terribly sinister was happening in the Shakahola Forest, which borders the village and bears the same name. Rumors of wailing mothers and children driven to delirium by a mystery man of God, mouths twisted out of shape like the Shaitani of Kenyan folklore. Malevolent spirits with distorted bodies and grimacing expressions had become more than just neighborhood gossip. Just 2 days before, 2 young boys, starved and shriveled beyond recognition, had stumbled out of the forest and into the town, terrorized by the secret lurking among the moringa trees. Their arrival all but confirmed that the neighborhood gossip was unfortunately true. Something awful was taking place just beyond the tree line, but the true magnitude of the devastation wouldn't be known until it was far too late. This is the tragic story of one of the worst cults in modern history and the fanatical leader who would go on to orchestrate the deaths of over 400 innocent people. This is the story of Paul Mackenzie and the Shakahola Forest starvation cult. Hello, and welcome to Diaspora Deep Dive. On this channel, I dive into mysteries and true crime that span the African continent and diaspora. If that's something you're interested in, or if you'd just like to support the channel, then please consider subscribing. Please note that this case is ongoing and still developing. I've done my best to present the current facts of the case to the best of my ability, but I just need to emphasize that all of these details are alleged as the court proceedings are still ongoing and the verdict has not yet been reached. Now, let's get into this. Paul Mackenzie was born in the year 1976 in Lunga, Kwale County to parents Mackenzie Kiseni and Anastasia Mwele. Apologies to anyone who is Kenyan. I am really trying my best with these pronunciations, so just a heads up, I am genuinely not trying to butcher these names, but I probably will. Mackenzie Sr., who I'll refer to as Kiseni, was a shop manager, while Anastasia was a stay-at-home mom. The fifth of 10 children, Mackenzie was described by his younger brother as an obedient child who was kind and fairly generous with the little we had. The children of the Mackenzie clan grew up with religion being at the center of their lives from the very start. Anastasia and Kiseni attended the Africa Brotherhood Church, an evangelical sect that was founded in the 1940s. Paul Mackenzie attended Mwawalewa School for primary school and then went on to attend Lukore Secondary School. Mackenzie's academic performance was lackluster. Ever the unremarkable student, he received C's in his Kenyan certificate studies. Even to his brother, he was, quote, just Paul. It seemed like just Paul felt just fine coasting through school with subpar marks because for him, where he really shined was in the church. Mackenzie's path to the pulpit was carved out from the very beginning. Paul showed his intense interest in religion super early on. He would enthusiastically participate in church life, going so far as to become a choir master and Sunday school teacher by the time he was just a teenager. After graduating from secondary school, Mackenzie moved to the town of Likoni in Mombasa to live with one of his older brothers named Ramisi. To make a living, Mackenzie and Ramisi sold flour as street vendors. After a few years of what seemed to be a pretty unremarkable existence, Mackenzie decided to try his luck in the coastal town of Malindi, where he made the career shift from street vendor to taxi service operator, and it seems like from all accounts, the business was pretty successful. Not a whole lot of information is known about this time in Mackenzie's life, but it seems like by the year 2002, at around age 26, things were going relatively well for him. He had created a successful taxi business, he was married to a woman named Agnes Mongeli, and was enjoying a life as part of the Christian community he had fostered within the Africa Brotherhood Church. Mackenzie was living the good life until that loving Christian community he was so fond of kicked him out for a quote-unquote misunderstanding he had with the church elders. But Paul wasn't going to let a minor spat get in his way. He and his wife Agnes became congregants elsewhere at the Malindi Baptist Fellowship Church, where he quickly rose through the ranks and began to preach. Mackenzie started to shape his identity and style as a church leader at the Baptist Fellowship Church. His sermons were pretty tame at first, but soon they started to include divine messages delivered directly from God, of course. Then the messages became visions, warning of a coming apocalypse. Apparently, this type of colorful rhetoric was totally fine with the leaders of the Baptist church, until one night, about a year into Mackenzie's stay, he had revealed that he had received a message from God claiming that the second coming of Jesus would not happen until the head of the church died. This did not sit well with the head of the church, and Mackenzie was booted from the second church's roster. His fellow church members didn't seem to have too much of a problem with it, though, as Mackenzie soon realized that he could just cut out the middleman and form a church of his own. So he set out on this humble endeavor with another member of the congregation named Ruth Kahindi, and they took a few of the former congregants along with them. Ruth would later go on to say that she saw potential in Mackenzie as a preacher. At this moment in her life, she was going through extraordinary health issues, and doctors essentially concluded that she was dying. I was so sick that I was bedridden. According to the doctors, medicine couldn't have cured me. As Ruth waited out her last days, helpless to change her fate, she had a prophetic dream that would change the course of her life forever. In her dream, God came to her and instructed her to open up a church. So she did. Ruth and her husband David got right to work. Mackenzie's expulsion lined up almost prophetically with Ruth's prophecy, and the Good News International Church was born. The now emboldened Mackenzie had developed a bit of a persecution complex, and Ruth was presenting him with an opportunity to build the following he had always envisioned. But whereas Ruth imagined a place for the downtrodden and desperate to seek refuge and regain a sense of community, it seemed like Mackenzie had other aspirations. With the help of Ruth Kahindi's daughter, Mary, her husband, Smart Makwalama, and some neighbors, support for the church started to first trickle, then eventually pour in. The sermons, once held in the modest front garden of the Kahindi residence, soon overtook the entire house. According to Ruth, followers from their old congregation began to flock to Good News International. Due to the rapid growth of their parish, Mackenzie decided to expand and buy land in Furunzi, Malindi. Building the new church became a community effort, with followers being encouraged to donate building materials and their time to erect the new structure. Good News International garnered notice not only in Malindi, but across the entire region. Still, Mackenzie's big break didn't come until he was eventually invited to speak in the metropolis of Mombasa. So a little bit about Mombasa. Mombasa is a gorgeous coastal city located on the southeast coast of Kenya. Known as the Gateway of East Africa, Mombasa is the oldest city in Kenya, and its vibrant history and culture is something that permeates the city streets even to this day. At this time, Ruth felt like this was a huge turning point for the church. Mombasa is the second largest city in the country, and not only would Mackenzie have the unique opportunity of getting to spread their message to more people than ever before, but it would be such good exposure for the church in general. However, the publicity was secondary to Ruth. The church had taken her from the darkest, most painful, what were thought to be final moments of existence, and had given her purpose. Her beloved daughter and son-in-law sold food at a shop right beside the church she had constructed from the clay earth with her own two hands. She was surrounded by love, but sadly, unbeknownst to them, the Mackenzie that they all knew and loved would never be seen again. The person who came back to Good News International, which I'm just going to refer to as GNI from here on out, after the trip was completely unrecognizable. Ruth recalled, "He started preaching things that we did not agree with, telling congregants not to take their children to school or go to the hospital when they were sick." Shocked and desperate, Ruth attempted to reason with Mackenzie, but it was no use. Sadly, in the midst of the splintering visions for the future of the church, tragedy struck. Mackenzie's wife, Agnes, passed away. If Ruth thought that there was any hope of the old Mackenzie returning, it vanished with the death of his wife. Any glimmer of the Mackenzie that she once knew was buried with Agnes. Apparently, Agnes had often disagreed with her husband's more radical beliefs, and this has caused some people to speculate on her true cause of death. It's even been theorized that she passed away during childbirth, in part because Paul Mackenzie wouldn't allow her to seek proper medical care, but sources on this haven't truly been substantiated, so take that with a grain of salt. Regardless of how Agnes met her demise, sermons after her passing centered around sin, doom, and repentance. Yet, instead of scaring off followers, this fear-mongering only encouraged the most radical of his congregants to become more devoted to him. The alarmist rhetoric stoked insecurities within the most loyal of his ranks, including Ruth's daughter, Mary, prompting her to close her quaint shop to devote herself fully to Mackenzie's cause. Mary and her husband Smart were amongst a group of other devotees who rose through the ranks within the church's organization by proving their unwavering loyalty to Mackenzie. In 2006, Ruth and David Kahindi left the church leadership and cut all ties with GNI without their daughter and son-in-law, and with Ruth's dream of a more simple and loving church turned to ash. This was also when Mackenzie's beliefs started to get more and more radical. Congregants were told that everything from their jobs to government legislation to the music they consumed and the beauty standards they aspired to embody were all sinful and corrupted. By this time, Mackenzie had already started broadcasting his sermons on his YouTube channel, Times TV, where he would go on to amass millions of views, which was honestly really surprising to me. It's hard to explain exactly why Mackenzie was so successful at persuading people to believe in his message. When I look at his sermons from this time, they come off to me as the distorted ramblings of someone who has fully lost the plot, mixing historical inaccuracies with anti-colonial rhetoric and topping it all off with a dash of conspiratorial conjecture involving an evil world-dominating cabal, usually referring to the Catholic Church or the US government. But the more I looked at this moment in Mackenzie's life, the more I kept coming across sources that all said the same thing. Mackenzie was, at the end of the day, just a good guy to talk to. He was the person who, even when he just talked to you and gave you advice, you would end up feeling so much better. That's a quote from Joseph Katana, an early church member at GNI. Mackenzie seemed to possess that uncanny charisma that so many of these culty preachers have. This ability to make people feel seen and heard and important and loved all at the same time. Furthermore, Paul Mackenzie wasn't just charismatic and charming, he also seemed to be magical. He would perform these miracles. Lots of early followers report seeing Mackenzie cure people of their mental illness and demonic afflictions. The veracity of these healings and miracles, of course, is always a point of contention and is something I'll touch on later, but the only thing that mattered was people believed in what they were witnessing. And what they were witnessing was a man of God healing people right in front of them. Ultimately, whatever was plaguing you at the time, whether it was dissatisfaction with your lot in life, anxieties about the future, or issues with mental or physical health, Mackenzie would listen and somehow convince you that it could all be blamed on some massive conspiracy brought on by the West. Western medicine and education were the root of all things wrong with modern society. Here's a quote from one of his sermons in 2010 titled Thirst and Hunger, Volume 1. "The devil put the spirit of questioning God, the Antichrist spirit, into humans using education. The world lies to you that education will bring you good jobs and wealth, but where are these jobs? Instead, all the university graduates bring in is pregnancies and drug addictions. Then the children all die of AIDS because of the devil's lies." End quote. So, yeah, I want to make it clear that I understand why this rhetoric was so easy to identify with. Mackenzie obviously laced his more poignant kernels of truth with absolutely insane oversimplifications, right? But still, a lot of the points he was making were really striking a chord with people. As erratic and nonsensical as it may seem, and I do encourage you to watch some of these old sermons for yourself so you can see what I mean, but his messages really hit home with people, not just in Malindi, but across the continent. Mackenzie used his eerie charm to his advantage, and GNI eventually ballooned to include 7 different branches, including hubs in Nigeria and Uganda. By May of 2015, Mackenzie acquired a local TV station to broadcast his sermons on television through the channel Times TV, where he would spout his increasingly extreme rhetoric to even more people and spread his message even further. Robert Mackenzie's younger brother recalled that around this time, he stopped merely mentioning his distaste of Western medicine and higher education, and he now became adamant about putting a stop to it himself. Paul Mackenzie would go on to convince the parents of his home congregation in Malindi to pull their kids out of classes. At one point, over 100 children were taken out of school. Yes, you heard that right. He harped on the dangers of education, but when he, a completely unqualified taxi driver, wants to be the one educating the youth, it's totally fine, right? It wasn't until sometime in 2017 when the grandmother of one of Mackenzie's followers, completely furious that her grandchild was being denied a proper education, reported the pastor to the police. Mackenzie and his second wife, Joyce Mkwamba, were charged with promoting radicalization and running an unregistered school. But Mackenzie, of course, had his own justification. According to him, the media and individuals always misquote or decide to run with a story out of context. The other time I made a sermon on earthly education being evil, and I was taken to court for telling children not to go to school. It is a prophecy, and it depends on how you take it. I can preach, but I do not force the teachings on anyone. Shortly after Mackenzie and Mkwamba were found guilty for the crime of running the unregistered school, Joyce, the second wife, passed away under mysterious circumstances. Similar to his first wife's case, sources on her passing also share conflicting causes of death. Some places say she passed away from pneumonia, but the National Inquiry into her passing found that her cause of death was unknown. Mackenzie, ever the lovebird, then ended up marrying a member of his congregation, Rhoda, and that became his third wife. I really don't mean to brush over Joyce or his first wife's deaths and lives so nonchalantly, but there is so little information out there about these women, and it's been completely eclipsed by the future abhorrent deeds that you'll come to know about their husband. But I just want to make it clear, I really did try to do my due diligence, and it's just sad that they themselves became victims of his crimes eventually. So in 2019, and I'm gonna try it with pronunciation again, the Huduma Namba was launched in Kenya. Think of the Huduma Namba as like a digital ID card for citizens, which helps them like obtain government services, similar to how a social security card works in the US. Mackenzie wasn't having any of that, calling the unique ID number, quote, the mark of the beast, and instructing his followers to not register. He was soon arrested on radicalization charges, and it seemed like this second arrest really struck a nerve with him. He came to believe that for him and his followers to be free from government tampering and interference, he would have to find a place beyond their reach. So after being released from jail, Mackenzie shut the doors of GNI after almost 20 years of operation and started to preach a new message to his congregants. This was the time that they had been preparing for all these years. This was now the moment where they had to leave behind their jobs, possessions, and families and take the final steps towards meeting Jesus by any means necessary. Mackenzie said that he hoped to create a place for his followers where they could cleanse themselves and worship away from the evils of the world. Now, the majority of Mackenzie's followers were very resistant to the pastor's propositions, at least at first. Even after his grand promises of acres and acres of luscious land for pennies with all the free food and water they'd need, people were just straight up skeptical. Sure, the idea of owning property was extremely attractive, especially for Mackenzie's impoverished followers, but the impetus just wasn't really there. Ramblings about Armageddon are all fine and dandy, but when you're claiming that the sky is going to start raining fire and the fire hasn't come yet, people start to lose faith. So Mackenzie was forced to begin his journey into the jungle with only his most loyal followers, including, unfortunately, Ruth Kahindi's daughter and son-in-law, Mary and Smart. The small group left Malindi and ventured about 40 miles to Shakahola, where they disappeared into the thick brush. Mackenzie knew for the rest of his flock to be convinced he'd need a miracle, or better yet, an apocalypse, and he wouldn't have to wait long to get one. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic had a profound impact on the world at large, but it is absolutely integral to how the rest of this case plays out. We all remember the early stages of the pandemic. It caused isolation and fear. It bred skepticism in government and distrust in science and medicine, and it was just the catalyst Mackenzie needed. See, at first, Mackenzie was struggling to scrape up enough people to follow him to Shakahola, but after the first few cases of COVID were reported in Kenya in the spring of 2020, people started to reach out to him, convinced that his prophecies were coming to fruition. Remember, these are everyday people, many of whom lived totally normal lives and held jobs and had families. They were now ready to drop everything and give it all up to move to the middle of nowhere, all because they were convinced of Mackenzie's message of apocalypse and doom. He had spent years isolating his congregants and radicalizing them, demonizing the material world around them, taking their very real dissatisfaction with the systems that are meant to help them, whether it be government, education, or medical care, and manufacturing a grand conspiracy to keep them from seeking out these systems that could actually benefit them. He told them that schools weren't suitable for their children, and instead they needed to gain their life lessons from the church and the Bible. He told them hospitals were actually morgues and encouraged them to stop taking their medications. He passed off these instructions as coming directly from God. Mackenzie continued to stay in contact with his followers and recruited them through messaging apps like WhatsApp. In the group chat Times TV team, Mackenzie and his closest followers could coordinate communication amongst the flock and recruit new members by incentivizing people to come to the forest, promising them a modern-day Eden. As the pandemic continued on, whole families left their homes in droves, bringing their small children with them. In their eyes, this was the best thing they could offer the most vulnerable members of their families. A safe haven from the evils of the modern world and COVID-19, the biblical plague that was here to wipe out the sinful non-believers and heretics, according to Mackenzie. Shakahola was seen as a utopia where they could grow their own food and sustain themselves with only their harvest and God's word. Followers, once hesitant to leave their lives, were now calling Mackenzie a prophet, begging to join him and escape the coming catastrophe. And I believe he felt vindicated and validated. Followers sold everything they couldn't carry, including their land and property. And where did all the money go? It was donated to the church, of course. You're not gonna need that money in the forest where all the food and shelter is gonna be provided, and you definitely won't need that nasty worldly money in the kingdom of heaven. People turned out by the hundreds, with the first wave of people coming in the spring of 2020, and then a second wave following around summertime of that year. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how normal and ordinary these people are and the range of circumstances that people were coming from. According to one New Yorker article, one woman, a flight attendant who had a long and successful career, sold her land and home for almost $50,000 and gave all the money to Mackenzie. The worse the pandemic got, the more people came and the more information and instruction that the Kenyan government and scientists tried to give people, the more Mackenzie railed and ranted against it, the more he condemned it. And he wasn't just talking to a humble little gathering of people now. Hundreds of people were living in Mackenzie's culty compound. A lot of people uprooted their lives to join Mackenzie, but some were still not convinced. Stephen Whitty had attended GNI for years, and he had watched the passionate sermons become more erratic and frenzied over time. But where his wife saw a free-thinking modern prophet here to deliver them and their family to the ultimate salvation, Stephen saw Mackenzie for what he really was: dangerous. When I watched that man preach that education is a sin and that healthcare is a sin, I asked my wife how this was the case, given that she could read the Bible for herself because she had learned how to read. She responded that God could do all things. I told her that I did not agree with that thinking. His wife began to secretly attend the church services without him, bringing their 5 young children with her. Stephen pleaded with his wife to return to the Christian faith they had once known and to stop attending Mackenzie's sermons, stop allowing this pastor to brainwash her and the children. The strain between them began to take its toll on their relationship until one day he returned after a long day of work only to find the home he shared with his wife and 5 beautiful children completely empty. Unfortunately, stories like this were a common occurrence, as many once tight-knit families found themselves shattered. People outside of the cult could only hope that they were wrong to be worried, that the pit in the bottom of their stomachs wasn't anything but nerves and their wayward loved ones had somehow been right. The eccentric, power-hungry, fear-mongering maniac who lured them out of their loving homes into one of the most remote forests in the country, was building a healthy, safe, and beautiful society for his followers where they'd all thrive and worship freely in perfect harmony with God and all his creation. Right? Well, unfortunately for the hundreds of people lured to the forest, Shakahola was far from Eden on earth. Survivor testimony is sparse, but what we do know is that the fertile land Mackenzie had promised was discovered to be almost uninhabitable, which was news to the transplants coming from all over Kenya, but not to the locals. Residents of the neighboring Shakahola village knew that the forest was not just some lush field in your backyard. The ground was littered with scorpions and snakes, big cats were known to roam and hunt freely, and the soil was practically barren in some areas. Followers had to build mud huts and lived on large plots of communal land known as shambas in these sort of makeshift villages. The villages were all given biblical names: Bethlehem, Nazareth, Judea, Emmaus, Galilee, Samaria, and Jericho. Mackenzie lived in Judea. The entire compound was miles from the nearest source of water, and people would have to travel these distances daily to fetch water and decide if the water was for drinking, farming, or showering. Attempts at getting some basic level of irrigation were barely functional and not enough to sustain the entire compound, which turned out to be quite complex. To put it simply, they were roughing it for the first few months while they were out there. So, what did people do all day? According to survivors, everyone just prayed all day long. There were no other activities permitted. Food was so sparse that people would have to sneak into the neighboring village to get extra biscuits and rice. According to Ya, an ex-member, you cook quickly, you eat, you hide, you take away the fire. Mackenzie himself would travel to each village, some of which were miles apart, and would regularly preach and pray for hours on end. When I read that and discovered that the villages were that far apart, it really put the scale of everything in perspective for me. The physical isolation from one another was intensified by disassociation with the world they once knew. Upon entry to the forest, people were encouraged to destroy everything that tied them to the outside: credit cards, government-issued IDs, even photographs of themselves and their families. Mackenzie even forced people to adopt new names, thus destroying all ties from the lives they had once known. And that was life in Shakahola in the beginning. Survivors report this time as being peaceful and pleasant. Despite the difficulties with the soil and the tiresome way of life, they were happy. It seemed like Mackenzie had somewhat delivered on his promise of a Christian utopia. But deep in the Kenyan wilderness lurked a threat much more dangerous than any animal they'd encounter, and things began to change. Precisely when the change came is unclear, but somewhere between 2022 and 2023, Mackenzie seemed to have snapped and fully bought into the idea that in order for people to meet Jesus, they would need to starve themselves to death. I don't know if the impetus came from the fact that food was already scarce to begin with or what, but once he got this in his head, it became the central theme of his entire message. At first, people were given a few pieces of bread and some milk. Then they were allowed one piece of bread, then none. Mackenzie would go from village to village preaching the virtues of fasting and how this was the only way that their souls would truly reach heaven. You have to deny yourself and go against yourself. You have to get to the point of ending your life for the sake of Jesus. Unfortunately, defecting was practically impossible by now. Lots of people had followed Mackenzie all the way up to this point. You see, with a lot of cult survivors, they talk about how difficult it was for them to leave because they felt like they had already given so much of their time and money and loyalty. Turning around now would make it all for nothing. And furthermore, what would they have left to turn back to? Mackenzie's power didn't just create a psychological hold on them, they faced physical barriers as well in the form of a literal army. Mackenzie had created a security force that patrolled the villages with machetes, hammers, and knives, and prevented members from escaping. This security force was touted as a good thing, keeping the demonic and corrupt threats from the tainted outside world from infiltrating the group, but in reality, Mackenzie and his hired thugs were there to enforce his strict rules and prevent escape. People who were caught trying to flee were tied to trees on the outskirts of the villages for days. A man named Lucky Chanzera joined GNI in 2018, and he was promoted to a member of the security force once Mackenzie moved his operations to Shakahola. Chanzera had been skeptical of Mackenzie's gifts of prophecy and spiritual healings, allegedly witnessing him planning fake miracles with parishioners in private. But by the time he had been promoted to the security force, he had established a good working relationship with the church, and he was desperate to keep his well-paying job. By the time he had wound up in the Forest, amongst the well-favored in Mackenzie's horde, he wasn't in a position to refuse a promotion. Not only was the security force paid well, but members were given rice, meat, and maize, while all the other villagers were forced to literally starve themselves. Disgusting. Once Mackenzie had established the security force, degeneracy and corruption really started to show, and things went from bad to much, much worse. Top GNI officials, once considered to be the most pious, respected, and remarkable of all the church members, were now giving into their most depraved and primal instincts. The security force was given free rein to sexually abuse the women and girls, often coming into their huts in the middle of the night to assault them. Physical abuse was seen as permissible punishment for even the slightest of offenses. Remember the sweet daughter and son-in-law of Ruth, Mary and Smart? Well, they had fully bought into the juju and were now doling out commands to the security force. Apparently, Smart was described as, quote, a heartless animal, and would go on to participate in one of the most bone-chilling rituals that took place in Mackenzie's cult. Wedding days. Let me explain. The people in Shakahola Forest, forced to fast, forbidden from eating or drinking, anything at all, of course, started to die. First, it was the children, the most vulnerable, innocent members of the community. Young boys and girls who were meant to be protected and nurtured were starved to death by their mothers, who themselves were corrupted and brainwashed by the evil preachings of one sick man. As the deaths became more and more of a common occurrence, they were twisted into being seen as a good thing. Rather than focusing on the reality of the situation, cult members were convinced into thinking that to die is to meet Jesus, and that's the ultimate goal here. This twisted way of thinking was accompanied by an even more twisted custom. When a member of the cult inevitably passed away due to starvation, the top GNI officials, Mackenzie included, whatever remaining family was left, and members of the security force would host a party of some sorts. Women, who were starving themselves, mind you, would be forced to cook food for this select few to eat, a small kindness for the bereaved. There would be singing and dancing and celebrating the person's ascent to heaven. The celebration would conclude with the recently deceased being buried in a shallow grave, vegetables being planted on the gravesite, and all traces of the belongings and things tying them to the physical world being destroyed. As things became more violent, wedding days became more frequent and barbaric. Soon, the security force was tasked with ending the lives of people close to death by strangling or bludgeoning them to speed up their meeting with the Lord. It's so twisted and creepy that they would call this like your wedding day, a day that for many is seen as the happiest day of their lives, corrupted and turned into a horror show. Smart would choose women and children close to death or who had tried to escape. He would choose for them to be murdered. It's alleged that at the height of this frenzy, as many as 10 people a day would be killed, and many of these executions were attended by Smart himself. According to other ex-members of the force, you were rewarded with money for strangling people, with each killing seen as some sort of twisted sacrifice to Mackenzie. And if you refused to kill, then you yourself would be the one strangled to death the next night. Things inside the cult had reached a fever pitch by the end of 2022, and like many of his twisted predecessors before him, Mackenzie set a date for the end of the world. Sometime in August of 2023, about 1,260 days after he and the first followers entered Shakahola Forest. The forced starvation and shunning of food was mandatory, and the top priority was to shed their earthly bodies in order to meet Jesus before Armageddon. Those villages, Bethlehem and Galilee, looked more like the decimated aftermath of God's wrath thrust upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Smiling, singing villagers had been replaced with barely breathing skeletons, gaunt with exhaustion and thirst. So many people had died, either from succumbing to their starvation or being strangled to death in their sleep. Mackenzie and his task force had made it impossible to escape. The route from village to village was patrolled routinely by foot soldiers, and if anyone found out you were planning on escaping, you would be killed. Still, for some people, dying while trying to escape was far more preferable than dying in that hellscape. Shakahola borders a national park, so not only did escapees have to worry about men armed with machetes and guns hunting them down, they also had to watch out for lions and hyenas attacking them as well. Despite all of this, some brave souls did attempt to flee. Sadly, very few people actually survived these escape attempts. Survivor testimony of these escapes described harrowing details of their journeys. Terrified women and men had to walk for 4 or 5 days at a time, only stopping to sleep during the day and traveled at night to avoid detection. Escapees were oftentimes absolutely delirious from exhaustion and starvation, and some people turned back because they just couldn't complete the journey. Others survived on whatever wild fruits they could find until finally they found the road that led into the village. Like I previously stated, these escape attempts were so rare, and the successful ones were even more rare, but if you're like me, you'd probably think, okay, this has to be the end, right? As soon as one starving, delirious, clearly traumatized person stumbles out of the forest where some cult is operating, it's time to raise the alarm. But no one talked. At first, survivors were extremely tight-lipped about what was going on in the forest. No one mentioned the murders or the starving or anything about what Paul Mackenzie was doing to those innocent people because they were terrified that if they did, Mackenzie would send people after them to kill them. But they were even more scared that something bad would happen to Mackenzie himself. Even after all of the trauma they had experienced and what they had witnessed themselves, they were still under his thumb. They still had that inkling of belief in him, so their need to preserve their loyalty to him trumped their own desire for justice. Come early 2023, rumors of what was happening in the forest started to circulate around town. It had been a while since shopkeepers had been visited by the friendly yet reserved mothers who would occasionally come by for a bit of grain or water, then return to the bush with their smiling babies. By now, it had been months since the last normal interaction with the members of the church, and the forest felt eerily quiet. There were rumors of moaning mothers littering the forest floor, and ever so often, a deliriously thin person would wander out of the brush. Yet very few who had emerged from the forest wanted to talk about what they had witnessed. And the ones who did weren't taken seriously by the police. That was until in February of 2023, 2 young boys, only 10 and 12 years old, had somehow managed to escape Mackenzie's cult and found their way to the village. They were discovered by Changawa Mengi, the man from the beginning of this video, one of the village elders. The boys were so thin and malnourished that they had resorted to eating sand to survive. Mengi immediately took them to his home to give them food and water, but because of their advanced stage of starvation, they couldn't keep any food down at first. But slowly, they began to gain enough strength to tell the most horrifying and disturbing tale Mengi had ever heard. According to some reports, there were actually 5 boys who had escaped, but only 2 of them had made it all the way to the village. Some reports state that a group of ranchers discovered the other 3 boys and took them back to the village to be nursed back to health. But after the boys had sounded the alarm on what was happening to the trapped members of the cult, Mengi began to organize a rescue party of sorts. In March, he and around 200 villagers decided to investigate exactly what was happening in the forest and try to save whoever was still alive. Armed with insider knowledge of the locations of the villages provided by the boys, the group ventured into the brush. Unfortunately, members of the security force attacked them, slashing at them with machetes, beating them, and even setting some of their motorbikes on fire. It was clear to Mengi that something sinister was going on, and Mackenzie was determined to keep it under wraps. They were going to need more help. Little did he know, just a few miles away, a devoted and determined patriarch was beginning to piece the horrible picture together and was hell-bent on doing something about it. On Friday, March 17th, 2023, a lecturer at Teachers College by the name of Francis Wanje received an ominous phone call from a stranger. The caller would not reveal their identity, but the warning the stranger shared made Wanje's stomach drop. The caller alleged that Wanje's daughter had starved her 2 children to death and had handcuffed the youngest child to prevent them from eating under direct orders from their wicked pastor, Paul Mackenzie. Now, these allegations were absolutely insane. to Wanjay, and from a deranged, random caller nonetheless. It was almost too outlandish for Wanjay to even entertain. But something about the urgency of the voice on the other line made him decide to make the 10-mile trek from Mombosa all the way to Shakahola to see for himself. I can only imagine what must have been going through Wanjay's mind during the journey. Like, surely his daughter and son-in-law were not capable of murder, much less the murder of their own flesh and blood. They were good people, upstanding citizens. His daughter, Emily Kaunga, had been a social worker in Malindi, and her husband, Isaac, had worked for the Kenyan police force. But as the buzzing skyline of Mombosa shrank behind him and dipped below the horizon, suspicion began to gnaw at Wanjay's mind. Early in 2022, Emily had begun to display some troubling behaviors. His once eloquent daughter, often lauded for her level-headedness, had began to share some really alarming beliefs with him. She was giving up her stable and fulfilling career as a social worker to completely dedicate herself to following her new pastor. But still, however irrational this felt from the outside, surely a Christian pastor wouldn't ever instruct their congregation to kill their own children. Unfortunately, Wanjay would discover that that was precisely what had happened. When he arrived at Shakahola, the village was already buzzing with police activity. He was guided to the shallow, freshly dug graves where his 2 grandchildren lay, and he began to weep. DNA and toxicology samples would later confirm the bleak discovery. My heart broke into pieces as I thought of the pain and suffering my grandchildren must have endured. Wanjay was able to be there for the last child who was barely clinging to life and showing all the signs of severe malnutrition and starvation. He had a protruding stomach, gaunt and hollow face, visible bones, and the poor child could barely speak. After he was given proper medical attention, and with the support and comfort of Wanjay by his side, he began to open up about the horrors of his older siblings' final moments. According to the young boy, his siblings were starved for days on end. Their mother forbade them from eating or drinking anything in hopes that they would pass on to the afterlife before having to face the coming apocalypse. However, the 2 children were resilient, and after surviving longer than any child should have to go without food or water at the hands of anyone, much less their own parents, their mother did the unthinkable. She approached them and callously smothered them to death. It was reported that Wanjay's daughter Emily still has not been found, and 2 weeks after the rescue of his sole grandchild, Wanjay suffered a mental breakdown. Sadly, stories like Wanjay's began to inundate the local police force, bewildered family members claiming they were looking for their spouses, their sisters or brothers. Even entire families began to show up and file missing person reports. The problem became too large to ignore, and finally, the tiny police precinct took action. On March 22nd, 2023, Paul Mackenzie was arrested in his home in Malindi. Yes, you heard that right. He was at home in his house. While his flock was roughing it in the forest, he was going back and forth to his home, eating food, sleeping in a nice, cozy bed, and living comfortably. Now, this part really confuses me and honestly pisses me off. The following day after his arrest, he was released on bail of 10,000 Kenyan shillings. That's like $75 US, which, what the fuck? Why? It's still unknown why Mackenzie's bail was set so low or why he was even given that option. I'm not gonna sit here and act like I know anything about the Kenyan legal system, but it just seems like he is clearly a dangerous individual. Maybe don't release him back into the public. Anyways, a team of pathologists were ordered to travel from Nairobi to Shakahola to begin exhumations. Unfortunately, the pathology team would face delays due to their travel funds running out, essentially stranding them in the capital for weeks. Despite these setbacks, the team finally arrived in the forest on April 14th of 2023, flanked by a heavily armed police force and first responders. As the outside world finally laid eyes on the devastation and horror that had taken place in Shakahola for the first time, Paul Mackenzie was being rearrested. Many first responders were haunted by what they saw in the forest. Some GNI officials and security force members fled deeper into the forest upon hearing about the raid, leaving behind those that were on the cusp of death. They fled so quickly it seems like people had just evaporated. They left behind Bibles, clothes, essentials. The secret pantries of those greedy church officials and security force members were full of rice, sugar, and food. Other church members stayed behind, believing Mackenzie's message to the very end. Exhumations were slow and seemingly never-ending. Mass graves barely covered from the surface were filled with upwards of 12 people and were unfortunately a common discovery. All in all, over 400 bodies were discovered buried in the forest, and it's believed that there are still hundreds more. Starvation was to blame for the majority of deaths, but some bodies showed signs of being strangled, suffocated, and even beaten to death. Many of these victims were unfortunately children. Some police officers would later go on to say that they believed most of the victims who were found clearly murdered by strangulation or beating died between Mackenzie's initial arrest in March and his rearrest in April, in a cruel and vicious attempt to silence them. A lot of people working on this case have been haunted by what they've seen. The bodies of innocent men, women, and children bearing disfigurement and mutilation shows just how horribly they suffered in their final moments. The number of people still unaccounted for ranges from 200 to 600. When I think about the gravity of the situation, the sheer magnitude of a tragedy of this scale, it's hard to comprehend how something like this could happen. When researching for this video, I saw a lot of Paul Mackenzie. In the sermons available online, you can see an electric and commanding preacher with fervent beliefs. His ability to string together seemingly unrelated phenomena and events in order to drive home his own wayward agenda and conspiratorial beliefs is fascinating. It's sadly unsurprising that so many people believed in him to the very end. And what of Paul Mackenzie? How did the person responsible for the forced starvation of hundreds of people react? In the limited clips available online of the imprisoned pastor, he can be seen bantering and joking with journalists, seemingly blissfully or willingly unaware of his own part in this catastrophic crime. Brian Ochara of The Nation described Mackenzie as, quote, jovial and upbeat. When confronted with the evidence of mass death in Shakahola Forest, Mackenzie denied everything. He claimed that he never ran a church in the forest and that what they were doing in the forest was nothing more than a humble gathering of God-fearing people pursuing a simpler way of life. The dead bodies? He claims they're all part of a massive conspiracy. The Kenyan government is dumping bodies in the forest for some unspecified reason and pinning it all on poor Pastor Paul. Despite his denial, Mackenzie, along with 94 of his accomplices, were charged for terrorism and the murder of 191 children in January of 2024. He pleaded not guilty. Although the trial began in August of that same year, it seems like justice is still sadly out of reach for the victims and family members of the deceased. Multiple delays and financial constraints, along with the sheer number of witnesses that have been called to testify against Mackenzie, have all caused the trial to just drag and drag. At the time of recording, the trial is still ongoing and none of the accused have been sentenced yet. A tragedy on the same scale as Jonestown happening in the 21st century is almost unimaginable and has left many to speculate how and why this could even happen. Mackenzie's arrest and the Shakahola Massacre have shined a spotlight on Kenya's rogue churches and the harmful effects of religious extremism. Evangelical churches had begun to spring up steadily since the 1980s, with Kenyan preachers taking inspiration from American televangelist styles and messages. Promises of miracles, healings, and communication directly with God can prove to be incredibly lucrative. I'm not trying to say there's anything wrong with Christianity or the evangelical church, but there is a clear opportunity for rampant abuse and deception. Preachers have been accused of faking miracles and healings while profiting off the desperation and hope of vulnerable congregants. Furthermore, there's no official governing body to keep these churches in check. The government as a whole seems to have a pretty lacking stance when it comes to the churches, with the previous Kenyan president, Daniel Arap Moi, even encouraging the growth of evangelical churches. With these presidential endorsements, prominent religious leaders then turn around and show their support for the autocratic president, claiming him to be anointed by God. In 2022, Kenya elected its first evangelical president, William Ruto, who pledged to promote and uphold traditional Christian values. Religious attitudes aside, many are still puzzled by Mackenzie's actions and have theorized about what led him to commit such unspeakable atrocities. Mackenzie has flat out denied all involvement up to this point, but that hasn't stopped people from speculating. One obvious theory is that Mackenzie is simply a con man looking to get rich off of scamming his followers into giving him all their money. Professor Jeff Wiwengo put it bluntly, in Kenya, if you want to get money, there are three ways. education, religion, and politics. Mackenzie picked religion. The proceeds from his followers handing over all their material possessions to the church lined his pockets and allowed him to live extremely comfortably. Sources close to Mackenzie estimate that all of the gifted assets amounted to over $700,000. Others think that Mackenzie was much more sinister than that. He not only wanted to strip his followers of all of their money and possessions in life, but also in death. Rumors that Shakahola was a farm for organ harvesting began to spread after some of the exhumed bodies were reported to be missing organs. Official post-mortem reports have established that kidneys, eyes, and livers are missing from some of the bodies, and it's believed that the entire purpose of the cult was a well-coordinated operation to harvest organs all along. To be completely honest, these are still just rumors, and at the end of the day, the result is still the same. Downtrodden, desperate people gave Mackenzie everything they had. They gave their lives, life savings, and hoped and believed that he truly cared about them and their families. They trusted him and believed that they were creating a better future for themselves and their loved ones. Instead, they paid for this faith and devotion with their lives. Amongst the devastation and remnants of lives lost, Kenyan investigators found something else amongst the abandoned huts in the forest. Copies of sermons from American pastor William Branham. Now just stay with me here for a second. We are going to take a slight detour because this is where the red strings across the corkboard really start to connect, and it's crazy. Okay. William Marion Branham was born in Burkesville, Kentucky in the spring of 1909 to a absolutely dirt poor family. His words, not mine. Branham's energy and charisma garnered him quite the following, and his popularity soared in the 1950s. Branham's teachings were controversial, to say the least. He was a firm proponent of the serpent seed doctrine, which is a fringe Christian belief that claims Eve mated with the serpent and their offspring was Cain. This created two races, the good and pure children of Adam and the wicked and evil children of Cain, aka black people. This doctrine was used to justify racism, particularly anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. Now, what the hell was a Kenyan taxi driving pastor doing reading some dusty racist sermons of some 1950s country bum? Well, funnily enough, Branham himself has been accused of running a doomsday cult. Branham often went on long-winded rants about the dangers of the education and healthcare systems. He also was a big believer in the atomic power of fasting. Atomic power is a concept best exemplified in the book Atomic Power with God Through Fasting and Prayer by Franklin Hall. Franklin Hall was a guy who also ran in the same sort of circuit as William Branham. They were part of this offshoot of evangelicalism called Latter Rain, which I could honestly make an entire video about, but basically the book detailed information on the methods and benefits of fasting to bring you closer to God. Fasting was seen as a way of showing immense spiritual faith and seemed like Mackenzie took this to the extreme. The similarities between Mackenzie's sermons and Branham's were striking. During the raid of the cult, highlighted and annotated transcripts of Branham's sermons showed Mackenzie's idolization of Branham. Branham not only influenced Mackenzie, he actually mentored Jim Jones, the American cult leader who caused one of the largest and most disturbing, what's labeled as a mass suicide usually, but I think mass murders in history in Jonestown, Guyana. And if you're like me, this entire story up until this point has probably been ringing alarm bells and reminding you of the Jonestown Massacre. A charismatic church leader preaching about the end of days tells his followers they need to escape to an isolated area to avoid religious persecution and survive the end times, only to be callously murdered mass execution style. Yeah, I just can't believe that Mackenzie was such a fanboy of a clear white supremacist. Like, he doesn't care about you. It's so weird, like his lust for power was so great that he's willing to put a literal white supremacist on a pedestal. This was the same man talking about how terrible Western ideals are, but he's also the one to latch onto this guy who popularized the serpent fucking seed. Oh my God. Anyways, at this point, it seems like despite this case sending shockwaves across the country, the government will do little to quell the rise of these extremist offshoot churches. Christian churches of all denominations hold great influence in multiple spheres of Kenyan life, and although many have come forward to condemn Mackenzie and his actions, as well as publicly grieve the unimaginable loss of life, they've done little to address the larger problem and suggest ways of preventing another Mackenzie from taking advantage of the systems and people he abused. This story was extremely difficult for me to research. There were so many victims who lost their lives in the pursuit of a better life. People whose belief systems were twisted and whose dreams were fashioned as weapons against them, used to manipulate, trap, torture, and ultimately kill them. Paul Mackenzie is truly the most vile and depraved of them all, a monster, a truly disgusting excuse of a human being. I hope that justice is served and that he never sees the light of day ever again. The evidence is, quite frankly, overwhelming, and I'm sure the courts will agree with me too. So, if you made it to the end of this video, I want to thank you so much. I left all of my sources in the description, and I intend on doing a follow-up on this case once the trial concludes. Please comment down below your thoughts, give the channel a like, a subscribe. It would mean the world to me, and I will see you guys next time. Take care of yourselves.